As I said, this is going to be slightly long, this particular feature of the school education as such. So one, this is very clear, until grade 5 or even until grade 8, the preferable medium of instruction is mother language. So there are some categorization that the policy makes in when it says mother tongue. It says mother tongue, home language, regional language, etc. So that is one thing. Bilingual teaching approach. Why is this important? This is a very interesting concept. There is something called first language, there is something called second language. First language is something that comes naturally to us, our mother tongue. The second language is something that we learn as a new language, but where our home language comes as a catalyst so that we learn it easily. So for that, this bilingual teaching approach comes in very handy. If let's say a child a child who is 5 years old, let's say it does a somersault, for example. So what do the parents typically say? In Tamil we say, hey, sama. So if the parents start saying super, then the child kind of starts understanding, okay, when there is a wow moment, in Tamil it's told in this way, in English that's told in some way. This is a very crude example of how bilingual teaching happens. Next, effort to invest in language teachers. So this is very vital, often overlooked aspect. In fact, when we move on to 10th, 11th and 12th grade, we kind of start overlooking the language part and focus more on math, science and everything else. So invest in language teachers right from the school level so that the language fundamentals are put in place within the children. Next, the language, this is important. Whatever is mentioned, whichever languages are mentioned in the 8th schedule of our constitution, those languages will have some teachers in the school system. 3 language formula, this was a very highly debated section of the whole national education policy. Initially the draft seemed to suggest that there could be a mandatory language, and it was kind of suspected that this mandatory language could be Hindi or Sanskrit or whatever. So that created a lot of backlash from different sections of the country, and so the final version clearly states that there is going to be no imposition. Of course, the students are going to learn 3 languages, but there are going to be no impositions. For example, if we do not choose to learn Hindi, that's perfectly fine. If we want to learn Tamil, Telugu and Kannada, that's perfectly fine. So that is one distinction that the final version kind of makes clear. But this one, Sanskrit knowledge systems, the policy seems to suggest that this might be one important aspect of how the students learn language as such. So there are 2 approaches that the policy seems to particularly suggest with specific focus to Sanskrit as a language. Since Sanskrit is the ancient language, we do not want to get into the debate of which is the actual ancient language and all that. That is a political debate that we will not include in this part of the video. But yeah, the policy gives some amount of adequate importance to Sanskrit while not diluting the importance of other languages. The other languages that will be importantly emphasized are Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, Odia, Pali, Persian and Prakrit. So that has been mentioned in the first itself. So no language is going to be left behind, or at least that's what the policy states at the time being. Then there are going to be foreign languages, these are only limited examples that the policy proposes, but there are also going to be other foreign languages only introduced at the secondary stage. So the important distinction that we need to understand is any Indian language or any any related language to the Indians will be implemented right from the early stages of education, while foreign languages such as Korean, Japanese, Thai, French, German, etc. will come in only the secondary stage. Secondary stage refers to, note that this is grades 9 to 12. Yeah. So again, of academic interest should be Stephen Krashen's theory of second language acquisition. So how a student learns a new language after he or she knows the native language as such. Stephen Krashen was a scientist who worked on the learning abilities of students with special emphasis on language acquisition as such. So there are 5 hypotheses that he puts forward. The first is the acquisition learning hypothesis. So there is a slight distinction between this. What is acquisition? Acquisition is what I mentioned in the example that was stated above. When a child performs something truly incredible and the outsiders, the audience, the parents or teachers say, wow, super, the child recognizes it as an appreciative response, even though the language might not be familiar, the words might not be familiar. That is acquisition. Yeah, this is how we learn our mother tongue. The first word we mention, or how we kind of observe and listen various things, and kind of it becomes like a muscle memory for us. That way, the second language is most powerfully learned through acquisition. What is learning? Learning is more like focused more on rules. It's like a formal thing. For example, if I say I is Giridharan, it might not be right. So there are grammatical rules in place that seems to say that for a first person noun, it should be am. I am Giridharan is the right way, I is Giridharan might not be the right way. So that is the learning part which focuses more on rules, syntax, the formal structure of the language as such, whereas acquisition is something that the child learns informally. The second one is a slight continuation to the learning part of the first hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis. What is monitor? Monitor, the literal meaning of it we understand. Someone to supervise, something to kind of make sure anything goes in a structured way. There's no chaos, for example. So the monitor hypothesis is a continuation of the first one in a way that let's say a child has acquired enough content or enough knowledge of a second language. Now there needs to be a place where the child moves from this acquisition part, which is more informal, to the formal nuances of a new language. So that is what the monitor hypothesis says. So a child can, for example, wow, superb is a very crude version of saying. If we put it in a structure and say, wow, the way you played is superb. So this is the structure that the child would want to acquire at some point in time. So this is a continuation of this one. Monitor is essentially in this context means the rules and syntax that are in place with respect to a language. The third is the input hypothesis. This is more or less similar to the monitor hypothesis in the fact that there are going to be some inputs given to the child by way of informal or formal means, and then the child starts learning based on that. The affective filter hypothesis, this is where slightly the cognitive abilities of the child comes into play. This takes into account a lot of different factors. For example, what is the motivation of a child? Factors that are normally deemed intangible. What is the motivation level of a child? What is the ability of the child? How much is the degree of inferiority or superiority complex the child has about itself? Example. So based on that, the affective filter comes into play. When the inferiority complex, for example, is very high, the filter is dense. When the filter is dense, the concepts of a second language do not go inside. It's like a opaque object through which light cannot pass through. Whereas when the self-confidence and the ability to receive an idea is more in a child, the filter becomes slightly less denser. So it is like a translucent or transparent object through which light can easily pass through. So the last one is natural order hypothesis. There is a natural progression the child learns, and it is very intangible and it cannot be measured through a series of tests as to how this child learns. You cannot say the child learns noun first, pronouns next, verbs next, adjectives next, etc. So a child might have some cognitive understanding of the different concepts which might not necessarily be in some order. That is the natural order hypothesis. So why is this important, or why is this relevant now in this context? While the three language formula seems to suggest that there are going to be different languages and L1, L2, the first language and second language are going to be part of the school's curriculum, there is a slight hint that there could be too much focus on different languages even though it comes at a secondary stage. That might dilute the learning or acquisition abilities of the student as such. So that is one aspect that we might want to be very careful about, not even forcing, not bringing in too many learning languages as part of the curriculum so that it becomes like a very superficial learning. So this is something. So what is NCFSC? National Curriculum Framework for School Education. So that's going to be a framework which states these are going to be the term goals, these are going to be the year goals. When a child starts in a particular academic year, at the end of that academic year, these are the learning goals that need to be achieved. So those are the brief set of overarching themes that the NCFSC will cover, and this will be updated every 5 to 10 years. So that is something that is very important. This updation part is something that we do not do quite some time. This is not restricted just to education, but on a variety of aspects as such. So then this one, 10-day bagless period. Why is this? What is the use of the 10-day bagless period? That's very interesting. So during these 10-day bagless periods, the students will get to kind of tour the community, get to interact with a lot of local artisans and craftsmen and get to know what the community is about and all that. There is a slight suspicion about this part on why this is being implemented in grade 6 to 8, because we've had different informal mechanisms to implement bagless. We have parent-teacher meetings, we have progress issue report day. On those days, there's no academic part that happens. So 10-day bagless period, this can be viewed both in a positive light and in a negative light. Let's not get to the debate now, but this is what the policy states. A continuation of it in the secondary level is the internship opportunities, where the students actually get to work with the local craftsmen, community, artisans, etc. This is like more of a, in our college parlance, this can be called as an industrial visit. This is more of an internship. This is like a window shopping. This is where we get to do the actual purchase. So yeah, so that's there. The next part, we touched upon it in the introduction part. Ethics and constitutional values are going to be given adequate importance. So there's going to be respect for the nationality, respect for what this country is, empathy towards fellow citizens, the diversity and inclusion, students being instilled with a sense of respect and admiration for their country, for their community, for the fellow beings and all that. So essentially, it all comes down to this: doing what's right. The students are going to be taught this moral part of it from a very early point of view. Our curriculum will be redesigned to be strongly rooted in the Indian local ethos. This needs no explanation as such. Assessments, moving from summative towards formative. We saw the difference between summative and formative earlier. Holistic 360-degree progress card. What are these 360-degree progress cards? We have seen in enough detail about what a progress card is. We know what it is: English, Tamil, math, science, English language, math, science, social, humanities, arts, whatever language we study. There will be a marker, there's going to be a grade, and then there will be a red mark which says you've failed, and there's going to be a green mark that says you've passed or scored 90, and then there's going to be a different color for your rank or whatever. But now this 360-degree progress card is like more of like a annual appraisal that happens in a corporate setup. So the student gets to review themselves, and then there's going to be a peer review. There are going to be intangibles that are going to be put in place inside the progress card itself. For example, this term, this student helped 10 children might be part of a progress card report, which was not the case previously. The board exam revamp and the coaching class culture. This should be strange coming from 2IM as such, but the policy seems to have a particular vengeance against coaching classes as such, and it vows to kind of eliminate the coaching class culture as such. But there are some contradictions in what the policy proposes, which we'll move on to see. The first is the high stakes aspect of the board exam will be diluted, meaning you need not go and sit in a public examination and then get frightened that your life depends on that one exam. That need not be the case. Best of 2 attempts, you can take 2 attempts and the best score will be taken. Most competitive exams we know do this, NMAT for example. Modularized examination structure. This again ties back to the high stakes part involved in an exam. So you might have 3 board exams, for example, in a year, covering term from term, and the marks could be accumulated later, and then the progress card would be issued. That's one thing. And the other thing is how the exam itself is structured. There could be 2 different types of exams, one MCQ and one descriptive. This again ties back to the different learning abilities of different learners. Some people might not be good at descriptive writing, some people may not necessarily be good at MCQ, choosing the right options example. So in order to provide for the development of all the students, this is very interesting. So these are 3 different approaches that the policy puts forth to reduce this and also reduce the high stakes nature of the board examination. Next point comes as a contradiction to this. School examinations for grade 3, 5 and 8 conducted by appropriate authority. What is very suspicious here is the school examination part and the appropriate authority part. Though the policy clearly states that it is only for developmental purposes, these 2 points are directly contradictory with each other. So why would you say you would take away an exam and then bring in exams at an earlier point of life? Grade 3, 5 and 8, why would they need a school examination, for example? So that's one thing. So the policy has certain aims through conducting examinations in these grades. Grade 3 is where the foundational program ends and the preparatory part starts. Grade 5 is when the shift from sort of a generalized learning to specific subject focused learning happens. So it makes sense for the policy to have these examinations, but there is always a lingering suspicion around why this is being implemented. Next, there's going to be a National Assessment Center. So when we talk about exams, it is also important to know who is going to conduct this exam. So there's going to be a National Assessment Center. This is the centralizing part of the policy that has come under huge scanner. There's something called PARAC, and we know about our fetish for acronyms and abbreviations. So this is Performance Assessment, Review and Analysis of Knowledge for Holistic Development. So this is going to be a center that will design different examinations for different grades as a benchmark examinations. NTA is National Testing Agency. This was one that conducted exams like IAFT as well. So NTA will work to offer a high quality common aptitude test, as well as specialized common subject exams in the sciences, humanities, languages, arts and vocational subject at least twice every year. So what is, the aim of this point is to kind of get rid of different examinations that different students have to write to get into specific thing. Rather, this proposes that there will be one entrance examination for medical, there will be one entrance examination for engineering, there will be one entrance for this and that example. So that's what this part focuses on. But again, whatever we covered, most points of it are debatable, and there could be different points of view according to this. We are only seeing the factual parts of what the policy itself enshrines and what it wants to achieve. Topic based on project centered clubs and societies. For example, there could be a poetry club, there could be math club, puzzle based club, dance club, arts club, etc. The very important point of developing all these the school ages to develop an all-round personality of the students, so that they kind of have a molded personality when they move to the higher stages of their education. Face digital pedagogy. This is the most important point. We saw during the pandemic itself that there are quite a few number of students who did not have access to smartphones, who did not have access to digital accessories, and that hindered or kind of played a blockade to their learning. The learning didn't stop for everybody, but there are some sections of people who are affected because they didn't have adequate resources to bridge this digital based learning. So the phase digital pedagogy is going to happen. So at some point when digital devices and gadgets such as smartphone and other digital devices are available, then the option of conducting digital tests from home, tests based on online portals, etc. will be made, is what the policy states. This NCERT and NCTE to develop a framework for education of gifted children. So who are gifted children? We call them through different names. Gifted children encompass all those people who are differently able, who are for some reason not able to learn at the right level or at the default level, if I may call that. NCERT and NCTE. NCTE is National Council for Teacher Education. NCERT we know, National Council of Educational Research and Training. So these two bodies will develop a framework for the education of gifted children. So this one is also of important focus here. Olympiads as a mechanism for entry to NITs and IITs. So on one hand, we have exams that are going to be conducted by NTA, which have been stated as common aptitude tests in the previous slide. Now we have Olympiads as a mechanism for entry to NITs and IITs. So those students who get a reputed score or rank in these Olympiads will get it by, for example, without writing the actual entrance examination to enter into these institutions. So this comes in conflict with what the policy proposed earlier, because it wanted to eliminate the coaching culture as such. But now what it seems to say is, if Olympiads can be a mechanism, why can't coaching classes thrive on Olympiads as a mechanism to train students? So there are certain conflicting areas in this particular part of the policy. Anyway, we'll move on. Next, now, so we saw about the more abstract parts, if I may call that, pedagogy and curriculum and what are the bodies or something we cannot relate to. But this is something that is going to be straightforward, that we can relate to very easily. The policy proposes different types of B.Ed programs. B.Ed are the degree, Bachelor of Education are the degrees that teachers do in order for them to be qualified as teachers. So merit-based scholarship to those who study 4-year integrated B.Ed programs. So there's going to be adequate focus to make sure that many people will want to be part of the B.Ed as a course of study rather than choosing some other specialization. Incentivizing teachers who take up jobs at rural areas. So this is very important because normally we come across schools in some news items. We come across schools where there are some 20 children and they move from one hill or one river to another river to study. These negatives have been bridged to some extent, but still the policy wants to do this. The teachers or the students, any stakeholder involved in the education process shouldn't have to travel along or have to face a lot of hassles for the education, teaching, learning process to happen. So one important aspect that the policy proposes is providing housing for the teachers who teach in rural areas. And since they teach in rural areas, that shouldn't come as a hesitation for them to not teach at the particular area they are assigned to. So that's one thing. So this slightly ties back to that. Arbitrary transfers. What are arbitrary transfers? Now we are not sure how the transfer happens. So for example, if a teacher wants to come to a school that is located in the heart of the city, she can do that by different mechanisms, and we are not sure what is the mechanism that is being in place to make sure that the facilitation of transfer happens. So those kinds of arbitrary transfers will be halted. No more. It cannot be done anymore, or at least that's what the policy proposes. Only under very special circumstances. We're still not sure what those very special circumstances are, and that the policy leaves to the local authorities as to decide how they go about it. And in order to ensure transparency and accountability, online computerized system will be put in place for the transfer mechanism to take place. So next, hiring process, strengthen TET plus classroom demonstration plus interview. So this is like a more or less any interview process that we are used to naturally. So normally the teachers, most of the focus goes here. TET is teacher eligibility tests. Yeah. So the teacher eligibility test is itself going to be strengthened, meaning the kind of aspects that the tests are going to be more rigorous, and then there's going to be these two components put in place so that there is a holistic approach to determine what the teacher is capable of. So there will be a classroom demonstration plus followed by an interview, and the scores of TET and all these will come together to form a cumulative component that decides the recruitment of teachers. So this master instructors, who are these? These are local eminent persons who are present in the local community. They can be good at multiple things. For example, one could be good at reading, writing, singing and drawing, and he could be a great graduate who has done great things in life and now wants to become part of the education system. The policy provides gateways for these kind of people to become part of the schooling education system, and the policy calls them master instructors, so that the students get to know about there are people who we know who have achieved this, and we can also afford to do this. Next, welcoming work environment. This applies both to students as well as the teachers. We saw in the earlier ECC part that the schools need to be strengthened, the infrastructure needs to be developed and all that. The same applies to the teachers as well. School complexes to eliminate isolation. So what is the school complex? Why does it become important, and how does it relate to welcoming work environment? That's something we need to discuss. School complexes are essentially nothing but, let's say there is a school in an isolated area. There are only 10 students. There are 2 teachers. Now, the policy states that this school with 10 students and 2 teachers is economically unviable to run on a sustained basis. So, what the policy proposes is sharing of resources between this particular school with another school probably in the next 3-4 kilometers, which has 40 students and 1 teacher. So that now when it becomes a complex, there are 3 teachers and 50 students together. Now the resource sharing becomes easy. So the resources in terms of infrastructure, in terms of teaching methods, in terms of teachers, students, etc., everything can be shared is what the policy proposes in terms of school complexes. And school complexes are necessarily not a new idea. It was already put forth in the 1965 on that range. But now this policy kind of suggests that this needs to be implemented at some level. To eliminate isolation, so this means that the teachers sometimes might feel isolated because they teach in a very remote area. Now by bridging them into school complexes, this problem could be avoided. Again, there are going to be certain intricate nuances about what constitutes school complexes. The school complexes should contain schools that are not more than 5 to 10 kilometers apart. That is one basic criterion that it is laid forth. Part of SMC, SCMC, what are SMC and SCMC? School management committees and school complex management committees, so that the teachers get to be a part of administration, get to be a part to interact with the various stakeholders like parents, etc. Focus on teaching activities. So oftentimes this is one aspect that the teachers keep complaining about, that they are not able to focus on the active classroom teaching component because there are way too many administrative tasks, such as entering marks on a digital portal, making sure the dropout is low by conducting a campaign, for example. These are activities that teacher might not necessarily want to do on a day-to-day basis or on a weekly basis. So this policy says the teachers will be given enough opportunity to focus only on teaching learning, so that the other activities can be offloaded from them. Autonomy in choosing pedagogy and SEL. Pedagogy is the teaching method that the teacher chooses to teach a particular concept, that the teacher has a degree of autonomy. And SEL is socio-emotional learning. Socio-emotional learning is nothing but a concept that teaching or learning of concepts that come normally under the soft skills bracket. So for example, empathy, trust, love, care, support, ethics, etc. So these are concepts that comes under socio-emotional learning. So that also the teachers will mold themselves towards. Every year there's going to be 50 hours of CPD for the teachers through workshops and training. What is CPD? We might have all heard this from the corporate lingo as well. CPD is continuous professional development. So there is a notion that, or there is a reality or a notion that the teachers get stagnant in terms of what they have learned and what they teach, irrespective of however the curriculum changes. So in terms of continuous professional development, the teachers will have 50 hours to spend every year so that they get upskilled and cross-skilled to kind of teach different subjects and get specialized. So merit-based structure of tenure, promotion, salary. So they are going to be, so this promotion, what do we think about promotion normally? When you think about it, we say if a teacher teaches first grade, for example, if she moves on to teach fifth grade, that's called a promotion, or that's how we are bound to think. In a banking structure, for example, we start as a clerk and then we move on to become probationary officer, that's called a promotion. But what this merit-based structure proposes is, there are two different types of promotion and salary incentives. So one is horizontal, one is vertical. Vertical is level based, from primary to middle to secondary to higher secondary. Horizontal is the kind of specialization or the kind of progress that the teacher makes in terms of this component will come into play to decide the promotion. For example, a teacher can still continue to teach first grade for 3 years or 4 years or 20 years, but the year on year there could be some salary incentive for him or her, because there is a learning component that the teacher has achieved. Special educators, course curriculum synergy between NCTE and RCI. So this is a very important component. Special educators, normal teachers, the teachers who are trained to teach normal students are not, or in many cases not trained to teach special students, differently able people with ADHD. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactive disorder. So there are people with those disorders which the normal teachers might not be able to focus on, especially given the different number of students that the teacher might want to take care on. So that is something the policy wants to bridge as well. So finally, by 2030, there are going to be these many options for B.Ed. The first is the full 4-year B.Ed. The teachers can choose to do that. But the policy also proposes other options so that someone who has pursued a different qualification might want to enter into the teaching framework. For example, if someone has done masters in physics and they want to enter into the teaching framework, they need not essentially go through the whole rigor of the 4-year curriculum. Instead, what they can do is they can study a 2-year B.Ed program, or like if they have done a 4-year multidisciplinary degree, engineering, for example, engineering in mechanical, or a BSc or an MSc in physics, they can do a 1-year B.Ed. So what does this do? This fast tracks the inclusion of teachers from multidisciplinary educational backgrounds into the school fold, as well as this kind of paves way for an increase in the talent pool of the teachers. So the last part of the teachers, and then we move on to the next part. Post B.Ed certification courses for specialization. So if let's say there is a teacher who teaches 3rd grade and she wants to know more about how she should teach the special children within the 3rd grade, she can do certification courses on that aspect. So that's one option that the policy opens up. NCFTE, we earlier saw about NCF-SE, which is National Curricular Framework for School Education. This is National Curricular Framework for Teacher Education. So that will be formed by NCT in consultation with NCERT. Now this is something that the policy seems to take a stern tone on. Stringent action will be taken against standalone TEAs. What are TEAs? Teacher Education Institutions. So standalone TEAs are the ones that offer only the programs that that lead to a teaching degree. For example, the institutions that provide only B.Ed, for example. So those institutions will be under strict scanner and they will be shut down if they do not meet the standards that is set by the policy. Next, equitable and inclusive education, the 6th aspect of the school education as such. So these are statistics that have been taken from the education policy document itself. These are not something that I have manufactured myself. So UDICE, the source from where the policy document takes this from is the UDICE document. UDICE is Unified District Information System for Education. This is an online portal where the database of all the students in schools are put in. So it says there is a huge disadvantage to these people across levels. So these are percentages as proportional to the total number of students. For example, if the total number of students is 100, the scheduled caste form approximately 20 students out of the 100. So if the primary level occupies these many percent, when it goes to higher secondary level, that's a significant drop. And the drop is even more pronounced when it comes to STs and the differently abled children. So this is something that the policy aims to address also. So it is this 20% representation shouldn't come down at any cost, because these are socially and economically disadvantaged groups who education might be the most important aspect more than the others in some cases. So there are going to be these mechanisms that are put in place to ensure this divide is bridged. Yeah, strengthening of schemes such as targeted scholarships, conditional cash transfers to incentivize parents to send their children to school, providing bicycles for transit. These are mechanisms that different governments in different states and have put in place for quite some time, and the policy just gives an extension to that. Aspirational districts. What are aspirational districts? Aspirational districts are those where the socially and economically disadvantaged groups. So the policy uses the blanket term SEDG, socially and economically disadvantaged groups, to address all these different communities or groups into one bucket. Yeah. So aspirational districts are those where the SEDGs occupy a majority. So those will be labeled educational districts and special education zones. SEZ is usually, we are bound to thinking in terms of special economic zones, but now SEZs also mean special education zones. Areas with higher proportion of SEDGs, so they will be given special incentives to kind of develop the schooling ecosystem as such. There is going to be a gender inclusion fund. This is specifically allotted for girls and transgenders to make sure the rate of dropout is reduced, because the policy states that within this gap itself, the gap is higher for girls than for boys. So that is something that gets addressed with gender inclusion fund. And then the final one is again Persons with Disabilities Act. So the Persons with Disabilities, Right to Persons with Disabilities Act clearly states that inclusive education is one wherein students with and without learning disabilities can continue to learn together in harmony and synergy. So the differently able students might not, should not come with a sort of a backlog just because they are differently able. That's what the Act says, and this policy has enough and more mechanisms to put in place efforts for them. So next is what we've seen a bit in terms of school complexes earlier. So efficient resourcing and effective governance. In terms of our government, we can call it as what is that? Minimum government and maximum governance. That's what the in terms of the parliamentary structure, minimum government and maximum governance is what the official slogan, if I may call that, is. Here it's called efficient resourcing and effective governance. And the main aspect to be focused on here is school complexes. We saw what school complexes are. We are going to get into some detail of specifics here. Again, these are data taken from 2016-17 UDICE. We saw what UDICE is. So there are 28% of India's public primary schools and 14.8% of India's upper primary schools which have less than 30 students. So this 30 students part is very important, and then you couple that with this, that becomes a bleak statistic. So there are more than 1 lakh schools where there are only single teachers, and there are these many schools where there are only 30 students. So the number of students are all in these schools are also less. The number of teachers in these schools are also less. So it is proposed in term through school complexes that will bring together these schools to form one cluster or one complex. So these are the mechanisms that the policy is put forth. But the important thing to note here is it is the duty of the states to do this. So far whatever suggestion has been put forth comes as a supervisory stance from the center, but when it comes to states and union territories, it becomes kind of a mandatory responsibility for them to achieve these mechanisms that are being put forth. Counselors and teachers for all subjects, sorry about the spelling mistake. Counselors and teachers for all subjects, adequate resources, building a sense of community among teachers, students and schools, cooperation and improving governance. So essentially what do these things suggest? These relate to any differently able student or anybody of that sort not being left behind. Adequate resources in terms of human capital, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of learning materials and all that. This is the most important, because when you merge or when you bring together several schools, there's going to be some level of friction between the teachers and students and all that. So some sense of community has to be built, and cooperation towards supporting PWD. PWD is persons with disabilities, and the last is improving governance through a degree of autonomy. So there's going to be some level of freedom that's going to be given to the school complex or schools, but there'll be a supervising authority to make sure these mechanisms are happen seamlessly. So school complex. So this is what the definition of school complex is: one secondary school together with all other schools offering lower grades in its neighborhood, including Anganwadis, in a radius of 5 to 10 kilometers. So this is the most important. So normally if you go beyond 5 to 10 kilometers, again the problem of dropout comes. So there are people who might not want to travel for various reasons. There might not be enough people who travel 5 to 10 kilometers to come to a school, and especially this becomes a problem and hindrance for girls. So the school complex is ideally should comprise of schools that are in the radius of 5 to 10 kilometers, and it should ideally have one secondary school coupled with all the other schools that are in the lower rung. Yeah. So this is what the proposal is, but the policy says the proposal put forth by Education Commission 1964 has not been implemented thoroughly, and this policy proposes to implement that on a more rigorous basis. So school complexes, semi-autonomous units, this is what we saw here also. Given degree of autonomy as to how they function in terms of what kind of plans they want to put forth for individual schools as well as the whole school complex. There's going to be supervising authorities. Absolutely, nothing comes free of cost, or nothing is going to be left unsupervised, for example. So DSC delegates tasks. DSC is Directorate of School Education. The DSC happens to be the statutory body across every state. So the DSC delegates tasks. What needs to be achieved in those school complexes will be put forth by the DSC, and the DEO and BEO will interact with the complexes, and the complexes will frame. So there's some level of understanding and cooperation between these three levels, but there is a degree of autonomy that's being given to the school complexes. DEO and BEO are district educational officers and block educational officers. So SMCs develop SDPs, the basis of SCMCs develop SCDPs. So what does this mean? So SMC is School Management Committee, SDP is School Development Plan. So the School Development Plan is of two different types, short-term plan, long-term plan. What the school wants to achieve for this one academic year forms the short-term plan. What the school wants to achieve in course of 3 to 5 years is the long-term plan. So the individual schools will develop school development plans, which will then come together in the school complex management committees, forming their own complex development plans. Yeah, and then the DSC is going to be the supervisory authority. They will provide resources for short term and long term. So this is a crucial aspect. This seems to be the more aspirational thought behind the policy, but we cannot be sure as to what degree this can be implemented. Proposal to twin or pair one private school with one public school. So the policy states that there are certain best practices that are being followed by a private school, there are certain best practices that are being followed by the public school, and when you combine the power of both of these, the understanding will ensure that both schools progress together to some level. Next, Bal Bhavans as part of school complexes, 1 day a week visit. So these Bal Bhavans are going to be like our PT rooms in school. You have footballs, carom board, chessboard, arts, crafts, etc. And these Bal Bhavans act as like a full day playground, for example, so that the students can have a bagless day and enjoy themselves. Standard setting and accreditation for school education. This is going to be the last part of what the policy enshrines in terms of school education. DSC to be involved in monitoring and policy making. So there are certain rigorous and rigid compartmentalization that the policy proposes in terms of which authority should do which function when it comes to school education. So DSC, Directorate of School Education, what they do is they now get involved in most of the different processes with regard to teacher transfer, compensation, school strengths, infrastructure monitoring, etc. But now the policy clearly states that the DSC's role will be limited to monitoring and policy making. So they will form the overall kind of supervisory bird's eye view as to what the policy should be in the state, in the regions, etc. But beyond that, they have nothing else to interfere in schools or in the regions functioning as such. No involvement in regulation or provisioning of schools. So they do not have a function. But if these people who are doing this function for so long are not anymore going to do this, who is going to do that? So that's where this comes in. State School Standards Authority or SSSA comes in place of DSC's this part. This part is going to be taken over by here, standard setting in consultation with SCRT. So when you set up a school, what are going to be the necessity standards, for example accreditation standards, so that this school can be deemed fit or operational, etc. So that part will be taken by SSSA. We might recall that there is one other SSA, this is Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, so do not confuse both of them. This is State Schools Standard Authority, which is going to be involved in standard setting. This is Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. Okay. Academic and curriculum standards. So again, this compartmentalization we have seen. There's one more level of separation where the academic and curriculum standards to be vested with SCERT. So finally, the states get some degree of autonomy to frame their own curriculum and pedagogical framework. The SCERTs should set up something called SQAAF. As I said earlier, there are too many acronyms and abbreviations, but kindly bear with me. So, School Quality Assessment and Accreditation Framework. So, this one, the SSSA deals with more of how the school should look like, what are the infrastructure, how the teachers should be hired, how many teachers should be there, how many students should be there, what are the kind of other resources that makes the school operational, makes the school appealing, etc. This one specifically deals with the academic part. What should go into the curriculum, what should be the pedagogical methods, what are some of the overarching themes that different subject teachers should get used to, example. So those are things that come under SQAAF, the School Quality Assessment and Accreditation Framework. So this decides what the curriculum should be. So next, the fourth different component. So we have seen 1, 2 and 3 bodies so far, and this is the fourth one. Certification of competencies of students. Basically, this means when we write an exam, who issues the mark sheet, who validates the performance of us. So that is going to be taken by BOA or BOE in each state. BOA is Board of Accreditation, BOE is Board of Examination. So essentially these are more on lines of examination. These are more on lines of teaching and curriculum. This is more on lines of school setup and infrastructure. This is more on lines of what the policy looks like. So this is the kind of broad separation that the policy puts forth. And all education institutions will be non-profit entities. No school should project itself as a for-profit entity. What does a not-for-profit entity essentially mean? It means that any income surplus or any revenue surplus that the school gains through course of its functioning should have to be reinvested back to the education itself, and it shouldn't go back to some other avenue. So that's what the policy puts forth as such. With this, we are more or less at the end of the school education as such. In the next part, we are going to cover higher education and how it ties back to school education and what the broad kind of overarching themes of the education policy as such are. Thank you for watching this video. It could be too long, and there are certain parts, as I said, that might not be relevant for you. So do not go into particular details as to understand or memorize each of these, but do have a broad understanding of what the changes are and how the policy looks like. Thank you. Hush.